Our baby Isaac was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and needed surgery for a tumor that took up half his abdomen. His odds were the flip of a coin. But at Seattle Children's, he had one of the most experienced pediatric cancer surgical teams in the nation, and they brought him back to 100% himself. Maybe 200%.
For kids with the most complex surgical cases, it's not about beating the odds, it's about changing them. Find your hope at seattlechildrens.org.
Did our consultation with Seattle Nanny, and then we hired the first one that we met. So that wasn't my intent by any means, but we were just really impressed with her. I think I did meet with one after her just because I was like, let's make Seattle Nanny do their job.
For sure.
But yeah, and then Isabel was interviewing other places and we didn't want to let her go. So it wasn't a long process for us.
Our baby Isaac was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and needed surgery.
Good afternoon. My name is Elaine Sulkin, and I'm the publisher and CEO of ParentMap. Thank you so much for joining us for today's Parent Ed Talk, Bias Interruptus, supporting anti-bias education at home and in school with Dr. Scotland Nash, Associate Director at Talent Rewire. For those of you not familiar with ParentMap, just like all of our parenting media partners who have joined us today from across the country, it's our business to build inclusive communities that inform, engage, and inspire parents like you and your family while hopefully having plenty of fun as well. We're extremely focused on how to better serve families, and being the parents and publishers we are, we never settle for the status quo. It means that our deep community connections, family advocacy, and unique partnerships allow us to help build a better village for families like yours. Before we begin, I'd like to cover just a couple housekeeping issues. Today's webinar is being recorded so that we can republish it for education and promotional usage, and everyone who registered will also receive a link to the recording. And then we also invite and encourage you to join us with Dr. Nash in a Q&A at the end of her talk. And the icon at the bottom of the screen is where you can just put your question in, and I will field those to her. We also, again, want to thank our media partners. It's truly a joy for us to have Baton Rouge Parents, Chicago Parent, Metro Parent in Detroit, New York Family, and NOLA Family in New Orleans, as well as our event sponsors, Seattle Children's Hospital, Seattle Nanny Network, Wayne County Community College District, Allegro Pediatrics, Charles Wright Academy, KNKX, Pacific Medical Centers, Morningside Academy, World Kids School, and the Ideal School of Manhattan. Dr. Scotland Nash has worked in education and education support services for over 20 years, working variously as
Hello, how are you? It's good to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. It is a pleasure to have the opportunity to be here. Elaine, thank you for your kind introduction. And I look forward to learning with all of you today. So I am presenting here on behalf of the ADL. I'm a facilitator with them and had been working with the ADL up until recently. Had the opportunity for an exciting career shift. But the work of the ADL in their anti-bias education is close to me and is significant and has been significant in the work I've done in education for the last 20 years. So it's a pleasure to be able to share this learning opportunity with you. I'd like to start just by telling you a little bit about myself and the context of who I am beyond what Elaine shared with you. I believe as an educator, whether I'm working with students, staff, adults outside the world of education, parents, that all students and students of any age deserve to live and learn in the comfort of their own skin. Therefore, we must have the courage to act. This was stated by Dina Simmons. She is a lifelong educator, activist. She has started an incredible network of educators of color and is really working to spread the word about how to bring anti-bias, anti-racist education into the current landscape. I really admire her work. The ADL's mission has been the same for over a century. It is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. This mission has really spoken to me since I joined the organization, in that it is one of empathy and compassion. I imagine that when ADL was founded, that there was a group of Jewish people who were looking at the defamation at the time, the hatred. It had taken place shortly after the lynching of Leo Frank in Atlanta. And there was a conversation about, we are in the United States and we deserve equal opportunity and just treatment. And as they looked around and considered the people that they are with, they realized that it's not just about securing fair and just treatment for ourselves, but let's look around at our friends and our allies and see that they too deserve just and fair treatment. And so it really became a conversation, not just among the Jewish people, but among people across different religions, race, ethnicities, and backgrounds. The ADL does their work through investigation, advocacy, and education. And I'm here really to speak to the education end of things. You probably hear a lot about the ADL through the investigation and advocacy work that we have done on a broader scale The education work I really like to talk about in the context of not just K-12 education, but pre-K and college education as well, the learning for all. The framework of this, of our education work is looking at these 4 pillars. The 4 pillars, the first one I know, I'm sorry, it's hard to see, is to explore identity. And exploring identity is really at the crux of the work that we do together. It's the idea of understanding who we are as individuals and what is the relationship of who we are as individuals to bias and power as it exists outside of ourselves. So we're really looking at our own experience. Then we think about this idea of interpreting difference, and they don't necessarily go one and then the next and then the next. They certainly interplay off of each other, but the way that we have it structured for you to see is that, you know, we always start with identity, and then we move into this idea of interpreting difference as part of the conversation. And it's how do we respect and understand people who are different from ourselves? How do we appreciate that difference? How do we speak across difference? How do we speak about prejudice, discrimination, bias? And how do we develop the strategies to communicate across differences? Next, we talk about challenging bias. We're going to dive into this a little bit today, in addition to having opportunities to reflect on your own self, but this idea of bias in terms of what is it? How do we recognize it when it shows up in ourselves? How do we recognize it and interrupt it when it shows up in others and in institutions? And how do we consider the potential intersecting oppressions that might occur as a result of bias? And we talk about what do we do with bias and oppression when it goes unchecked? Finally, I want to bring to attention the idea of championing justice. And this is the idea of taking the skills that we learn and confronting bias in ourselves, others, and institutions. It's the action step, which is a really critical piece to this work. And I just want to acknowledge that by your being here today, you are actually considering all of these pillars. By being here and showing up, I'm going to give you the opportunity to do some self-reflection in this work. And I'm going to ask that you take your learning and bring it elsewhere. You bring it to your friends, you bring it to your schools, you bring it to people that you interact with, because the idea here is that we really do want to champion justice and expand and grow this work. The other critical piece that the ADL uses when we talk about understanding bias is what we call as our pyramid of hate. And what I want to acknowledge is that in the United States, in the United States right now, we are having a national conversation about that green level of the pyramid, that systemic discrimination that's been taking place, that we have evidence of conversation around criminal justice disparities, inequitable school distribution, housing segregation, wage disparities, voter restrictions, unequal media representation. That this has been the broader national conversation, and it's a critical conversation. What we're going to focus on today, and it has resulted in bias motivated violence. What I really want to focus on today is how we can control and can contribute to the conversation about disrupting the systemic discrimination. And it's by really looking at these purple and blue levels of the pyramid. We want to understand our own internal biases. That's the purple level, the bias attitudes. Are we stereotyping as individuals? How are you potentially afraid of people who are different from you? Are you finding that you're spending time justifying some of your biases and seeking only like-minded individuals? The idea of a lack of self-awareness and a lack of self-reflection will really, when that goes unchecked and these ideas go unchecked, potentially lead to the acts of bias, where that implicit or the internal pieces show up as explicit. Things that are happening in terms of using non-inclusive language, making insensitive remarks, making biased and belittling jokes, microaggressions, slurs, dehumanization, ridicule, name-calling, bullying. And so when we talk about the acts of bias and how they might show up in schools, we really are framing it around identity-based bullying and what may happen as a result of not understanding our own biases. So the conversation today is we're going to first explore what is bias? What is the conversation we need to have? And we're going to think about our individual ways to check our own biases. And we're going to think about the more that we understand ourselves, the more that we share our understanding, we will begin to topple this pyramid and impact systems of discrimination. And that's really the work that we're here to do today. So while I'm talking for the next, half an hour, there are going to be lots of moments for you to pause, reflect, and engage. And I'm going to ask that you really take those opportunities to heart and think about what are the ways that you are learning in this experience and what are going to be your own personal next steps in this journey. Sometimes in schools, and I know we have a lot of parents here, and I think we might have some educators as well, I like to share that people say, are you serious? You start this in pre-K or you start this in kindergarten? The answer is yes. We know from research purposes that bias and negative attitudes towards difference start as early as ages 3 to 5. So that is before children are even entering a traditional school structure of kindergarten. Happens on the playground, happens on places and spaces where we are engaging with our kids. We also know that once we look at school systems, that more than 1 out of 5 children report being bullied. And these statistics are a little bit dated in terms of they're a couple years old, and I don't have the most recent data, but there is a really intense conversation that's happening in education right now around the conversation of identity-based bullying, particularly in the last 2 years, and what happens with social media and what's happened in virtual education. We know that more than half of bullying situations stop when a peer intervenes on behalf of a student. So our programs, oftentimes in schools, are peer-to-peer programs where we're really working with students so that they learn how to advocate for themselves and show up as allies to their peers. That peer intervention is really crucial in terms of change. And that school-based bullying prevention programs decrease bullying by up to 25%. And that's why our work, I believe, is so valuable. And I really appreciate your being here and thinking about ways to share and talk about the work moving forward with your schools and with your own children. So let's dive into the meat of the work. The meat of the work right now is let's examine our own biases. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a couple words up on the screen. And as I share these words, I know that you're not going to be chatting and I know you're not going to be sharing, but I want you to maybe write down on a sheet of paper or type into your phone, what is the first thing that comes to mind when I put these different words on the screen? Salt and. So when I put up there salt and, my guess is you have a word that would come after that and I want you to write down what that word is. Just like shoes and, what comes to mind? First word that comes to mind, first thought that comes to mind when you hear shoes and. Up and, up and. Peanut butter and, peanut butter and. And what I can tell you as I look at these, I can say, even though I can't see what you're thinking, that the vast majority of you were probably thinking shoes and socks, salt and pepper, up and down, peanut butter and jelly. Now, I do this oftentimes, this activity with educators and with folks in much smaller settings. And what ends up happening is as people begin to share, you do begin to learn a little bit about people through these really simple associations. I know that I'm speaking to an Oregonian, particularly from Portland, and now some Seattleites, when they say salt and straw. That's an ice cream spot in the Pacific Northwest that's quite popular. I know that I can connect with people when instead of writing peanut butter and jelly, they write peanut butter and honey or peanut butter and chocolate. And the reason I always go to that is jelly was never the first thing I wrote down, because as a child, my mom didn't give us peanut butter and jelly. She gave us peanut butter and honey. That's what she grew up with. That's what I ended up eating. And now as an adult, it's peanut butter and chocolate. But with my own kids, I do start giving them jelly. You might start thinking to yourself, why on earth is she talking about this? I want you to hold on to this conversation for just a minute and think about your associations and think about how those associations, where do they come to you from? What time in your life, what space and place do these associations come to you? When did you realize that it was peanut butter and jelly? How did you learn that it was salt and pepper? Maybe it's salt and vinegar. Then I know you really love maybe Tim's potato chips. So just hold on to this for a minute, and I'm going to take us to the next experience that I want you to think about. I'm going to put an image on the screen with a caption. And as I put the image on the screen with a caption, I want you to think for a second, what is the story that this picture and caption is telling you? What's the story? The caption says, 2 residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store in New Orleans. So take a second, look at the picture, make some noticings, consider the perspective, consider the captions. What do you see and what do you read? For me, I immediately go to thinking about Hurricane Katrina. I'm going to share you another picture with another caption, also from a reputable source at that time. A young man walks through chest-deep floodwater after looting a grocery store in New Orleans. Same time, same experience, different story. Reputable sources. So some of the critical pieces that you would want to potentially pay attention to is that in the first picture, you see 2 white people walking through the water, and it's really a story of survival, right? They're wading through water, they're searching for bread and soda so they can survive. They've got backpacks on, and you know, they're residents of the area. Yet in this picture, also from a reputable news source, you have a young man who's actually a young boy who's walking, not wading, through chest-deep floodwater, and he's looting a grocery store. Now, we don't need to talk about what they're each carrying in terms of what you can actually see, because the picture is hard, but you can see that this boy is shaded in terms of the color and how he's being seen, and that he's carrying a black opaque bag. He doesn't have on a backpack. The question is what are the stories that you're hearing from the news as you're reading about the events? I'm going to share a short video with you. I'm going to hope that it all works. I'm going to share a short video with you, and then I'm going to pull all of these pieces together. What is the connection that I will be making with you when we think about this idea of associations, and we're talking about something like peanut butter and jelly? We move into some news sources and we're thinking about what is our media telling us about a particular situation. And we're going to move into a short video clip for just a second to kind of bring it all together. And then we're going to move into some self-reflection. So let's hope that this works. Here we go.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times, when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race, and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's the scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
So the reason I always share that video is because I think it's super important for us to acknowledge that bias is part of who we are. It's part of where we come from. It's part of our upbringing. It's actually part of our meaning making. When I hear that you have a bias for peanut butter and honey, I can immediately make a connection with you, right? However, some of those biases, those associations, those connections we're making are relatively harmless. But what we need to understand is that we don't always have control of what it is that's helping our meaning making. If my mom had me growing up with peanut butter and jelly, I may never have even thought about peanut butter and honey. When we look at the pictures that are coming at us from the media, that is supposed to be a space and place where we're looking for an unbiased source or a lack of bias in information gathering, we're thinking about the fact that they are telling us what we need to know. And what I want us to begin to think about is, as we read the media, how do we discern when there might be texture to the story that we might need to unpack? Now, that's not just in the case of media in general. That's also in the case of conversations that we engage in, education that our kids are participating in. How do we begin to understand that while we all have biases, we're born with them, a preference for or against a certain item or thing, but in this particular case, we're talking about a preference for or against an individual or group that interferes with impartial judgment. I might have an affinity towards everybody who likes peanut butter and honey, right? That might be my immediate connection. That's a preference I have for a group. That is okay, right? If I treat those people differently on this webinar and I find out who they are and I only answer their questions, it's interfering with my impartial judgment and my ability to show up. So it's moving into that range of explicit bias. I am consciously saying I am only going to call on these people, right? Based on my experience and how I connect with them. What we need to be aware of is that we don't just have biases that are explicit, we have biases that are implicit. Those are those unconscious attitudes that we're developing over the course of a lifetime through exposure to all of these different kinds of messaging. What we're getting from our parents, what we're sharing with our children, what we're getting from our friends, what we're hearing from our teachers, and what we're hearing from the news, what we're watching on TV. All of these different pieces are forming who we are and what we believe and how we show up. And so it's important that we begin to raise awareness around what it is that we are hearing and what we are seeing. And what we're finding, right, in the United States is that that bias is presenting itself not in the simple way like I was talking about with peanut butter and honey, but in a very significant way in our history. And the piece that it is showing us is that there is a system that has happened based on biases over time that in our systems at the green level of the pyramid are negatively impacting people of color. So when we think about race, I want us to think about the fact that it is a social classification system that was created for social and political reasons. It is not biological. And that these opinions that we have in terms of classifying people for social and political reasons have led to a system of racism, so systemic racism. And it's when we are pulling together all of these pieces that we are creating systems that harm and disadvantage people of color. What's also important for us to know is that not one of the 100 people who are in the room right now created this system that is racist. Our job is to unpack the system and think about how can we contribute to improving on the system that has existed. So there is not one person here who is responsible for the creation of systemic racism. What we are responsible for is understanding our individual biases and figuring out how is it that we can create a space and place that is better for our children and a space and place that is better for each of us moving forward. And as I said, some of this we didn't even have control over. And I think that this is the piece that I'm going to use to launch us into, now that I know that I have biases, now that I know that these biases are coming to me and I didn't even know that some of the information out there was contributing to my own biases, how do we interrupt this cycle that I'm showing you on the screen? What we know is that unchecked implicit bias leads to structural racism, and structural racism leads to continued unchecked implicit bias. That we are making associations and assumptions about particular people based on history, policies, and practices that exist in the United States, and it's leading to inequitable outcomes and racial disparities. Those inequitable outcomes and racial disparities continue to build our assumptions, create our associations, and it becomes this cycle that until we choose to interrupt it and understand our biases, understand our context, it will continue. There's a conversation that exists out there right now that says, is that really true? Is there really structural racism? Is this a fact? Well, we have a lot of data that proves that in fact it is true that people of color, particularly people who identify as Black, have less opportunities in the professional workforce, are getting suspended and expelled from schools at higher rates, are more highly proportionately represented in prisons. So we have all of that data, but I want to connect it to you personally for a second. I can't see everybody on the screen. So what I want you to do is an activity for yourself. Again, this is another self-reflection activity. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put some statements up on the screen. And if this statement is true for you, I want you to raise a finger. There are going to be 10 statements. So if you can easily find picture books, postcards, toys, and dolls that feature people of your race, please raise a finger. Television and movies routinely depict people of my race in a wide range of positive roles. I can arrange to be in the company of people of my race most of the time. I am certain that if I need legal or medical help, my race will not negatively impact me getting that assistance. I can do well in a challenging situation without being perceived as a credit to my race or an exception to the rule. I can be late to a meeting without having the lateness reflect my race. I'm never asked to speak for all of the people in my racial group. I can take a job with an affirmative action policy without my coworkers or peers assuming I got it because of my race. I can go shopping without concern that store employees will follow me and or monitor my actions because of my race. Children in my racial group do not need to be educated about systemic racism for their daily physical safety. What did you notice? It says share in the chat box, but my guess is that I'd prefer for you to just kind of make some notes and reflections to yourself. What did you notice? How does this make you feel? What can I do now that I know what I know? This particular exercise was geared specifically towards the conversation about race. As a white woman, I could raise my hand, every single one of my 10 fingers. And I know how that makes me feel. There are people in the room who probably can't raise all 10 fingers when you're talking about race. There might be people in the room who couldn't raise any. It's this conversation that I want us to understand this idea of privilege. I didn't do anything special to be able to raise all 10 of my fingers. I simply was born white and I identify as white. So in this particular situation, what I can share is that I have the privilege of my race to not have any of the disadvantages that might have come up for some other people in the room. Now, privilege has been spoken about most recently in terms of racial privilege. We can also look at privilege in other aspects as well when we're talking about sexual identity, when we're talking about gender, when we're talking about different aspects of how we identity. We can talk about religion, but there are privileges in lots of different spaces and places. For the purpose of the activity I just led, it was really around racial privilege. So the question that I ask is, now that we know what we know, what is it? What can we do? How can we show up? And the idea is how do we move from being a bystander who might have certain privileges in certain situations to making sure that we're showing up as an ally? And that idea of ally is really verb oriented. How do we move from safe to brave? How do we make sure we take a risk and stand up for people who are different from who we are? And how do we use our privilege as a benefit to advocate with folks who are in marginalized situations and spaces? How do we dismantle that system of oppression? We can move through this pyramid where we're saying, let's really focus on these bottom two in terms of bias attitudes and acts of bias. It's going to be super important. And we're going to give some specific examples around these, around how do we follow voices that are different from our own so that we don't get into our own bubble of hearing one thing? How do we observe for patterns of bias? How are we diving into media? Are we engaging with folks who are different from different identities from who we are? Are we reading? Are we learning? Are we challenging ourselves to think about perceptions that we might have had in the past? There's the implicit association test with Harvard. How do we show up? Things that we didn't even know that shows up. When we move up to acts of bias, do we say something when we hear something? Do we say something when we see something? Do we engage in conversations with our friends, with colleagues, in appropriate spaces and places? Do we step in when we see that there's been a harassing or biased situation? And ultimately, if we begin to think about these blue and green levels and those things that we as individuals can really control, how do we insert ourselves so that we begin to disrupt? In this case, it's the yellow, the systemic discrimination, which is how do we vote and advocate and activate around creating opportunities where we are dismantling the systems of oppression that exist. So I want to be really explicit. I'm going to share first a strategy about how to stand up, because I know that it's really hard sometimes to think about when I see something to say something. And I know that this is a strategy I use with students. This is a strategy I use with adults. And this is a strategy I use for myself. I stop, I think, I feel, I act. My first step in this is to stop an action that I see. Now, granted, sometimes it's my individual inserting myself to stop the situation if my safety is not at play. I don't want my physical safety or the physical safety of another person to be at higher cost, but I stop that action. And so in a situation where I feel like I am able to insert myself specifically to stop the action, I will say, stop doing whatever I see you doing. I'll pause and think about, how do I clarify to better understand what might have been happening? So these stop and think pieces are kind of going back and forth in my head at the same time. And this is the piece that I think is really hard. It's to describe how it made you feel and why. What made you feel as such that you wanted to intervene, that you wanted to step in? And then provide an alternative action. So sometimes if you hear something, you might say, wait, did I just hear you say, that really made me feel sad, that made me feel uncomfortable? Can we try framing it that way? Have you thought about? The role of open-ended questions in the feel act piece is super important. The other piece that's super important is not to project your feelings onto someone else, but to simply share your feelings and ask from a genuine place of interest in learning and concern to seek better understanding. So stop, think, feel, act. Really great framing to consider how to intervene to move from bystander to ally. The other pieces that I want to share with you are resources. The ADL, the two favorite resources I have for the ADL that I think are super tangible and easy for anybody in this room to use, whether you're here as an educator, a parent, or a grandparent, role model, a mentor, or whatever, are the ADL table talks and the ADL books that matter. So our table talks are updated frequently. And the table talk is really grounded around the idea of, how do you have a family conversation about something that's difficult or hard to talk about? And so we'll take incidences that have recently occurred in the media, and we will provide a structure for you to engage in that conversation with someone at home. We'll typically give a youngest age range. You know, if some of them are relevant for 10-year-olds, some might be relevant starting at 14 or 15. But the idea is that we give a short summary of the situation that is as fact-based as we can possibly get it. And then we pose some simple questions to kind of bring our young people into the conversation, to bring our peers into the conversation sometimes. Then we have some questions to dive deeper, connect it to other situations, for instance. And then following that structure, we really talk about, now that you've learned a little bit more, what are our next steps? Do we need to read more about something? Do we need to engage in a conversation with someone? Do we need to write a letter somewhere? So again, it's really action oriented. Great resource. You can go to adl.org/education and type in table talks. The other one is our Books That Matter series. And that is a curated list of books around a variety of topics. And when I say curated, what I mean is that we think about the authors who wrote the book. We think about the authors being aligned with the content of the book that was written. And so the hope is that we are curating a really representative mix of authors, and that we have a really wide range of topics, considering everything, as you can see here, for example, in terms of thinking about sexual orientation, perhaps, to race, to identity. We bring up things around learning differences. We bring up things about size, weight. We bring in gender, all sorts of different conversations in our Books That Matter. And when our Books That Matter have been chosen as Books of the Month, we curate those as well. And with those, we have both family and school discussion guides. So what I want to share is, and those family and school discussion guides are a great way to link a school and a family together. So there were some questions that came in prior to today's presentation, and I really highlight these two resources for anybody listening who raised the question of, how do I engage with my school to make sure they're bringing up conversations about race and identity, dyslexia, dysgraphia, learning differences? How do I make sure that when they're having conversations at school about current issues, that they're raising the conversations in a way that is healthy so that everybody feels safe and comfortable? These two resources are resources that I encourage you to share with your schools. Librarians are a great point of reference for this because they love to build out their libraries. Parent-teacher associations, choosing books to give to the school that come from our Books That Matter series, great way to start thinking about things. Buying the books for home that are Books of the Month and engaging in conversations with your own children about any of these topics that you might want to talk about. Being aware that if something comes up in the news that maybe isn't super current, but is connected to something that has happened in the past, but exploring our table talks and family conversations about structured ways to have meaningful conversation around difficult topics. There are a couple other things up here for the educators in the space. We have great lesson plans and professional learning for the educators. So they're direct lesson plans that teachers can use in the classrooms with students. So even families, if you're involved and let's say you're having a food drive at your school, how are you bringing that idea of a food drive into understanding socioeconomic difference? We have lesson plans in places that we can go to and turn to, and professional learning for the educators in the space as well. The last piece that I want to share with you is just 10 ways to show up, 10 ways to be an ally. Listen, educate yourself, get involved, show up, speak up, intervene when you can, welcome discomfort. Discomfort doesn't mean bad. Discomfort means that we are learning. We need to learn from mistakes, stay engaged, and feel free to donate to organizations that really are advocating and working for the marginalized communities in which we are trying to support. There are many resources out there in terms of TED Talks, in terms of movies, in terms of podcasts and books to consider. This is just a really quick list. I did share the ADL resources. Those will go up in a follow-up email, but feel free to take a picture of the screen. And with that, I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to open it up for any questions that people have. And I want to thank you so much for taking your time to be here with me today for the last 45 minutes. And I'm going to open up for questions.
Thank you. I want to apologize. I don't know if it was, I got bounced off the internet, the work of being at home. Dr. Nash, first of all, you did such an outstanding job providing us with our own reflection and insights and giving us the opportunity to kind of go on this journey with you. And then thank you for the outstanding resource at the end. I want to add one more because for sure the ParentMap audience over the last year has been exposed to our collaboration with Jeffrey Robinson, who created the Who We Are project. It's a 3-hour chronicle of racism for 400 years. So it has been turned into a documentary, which is quite different than the 3-hour presentation. It has, if you Google Who We Are Project New York Times, you'll be astonished at the review it got. So I really encourage people. It's something that, you can watch together as a family at any age, and it's just an extraordinary resource and available also for community screenings and for schools. You actually covered many of the questions in your talk, and one came in from somebody in Chicago, Leanne, and she is, I talk about welcoming discomfort. She says, I feel like often the term racism now gets overused. There's so much positive that has come from the difficulties and challenges and horrors of the last couple of years. But I feel that in conversations, I'm stifled because if I say something, for instance, about, I feel very strongly, this is a quote, I feel strongly that schools should have been the last to close and the first to open before liquor stores or whatever, she put a fill in the blank, that I get silenced because then I'm injuring Black children. I'm a racist. Can you talk a little bit about that? It's you're seeing a lot of this right now with moms, especially like running for office and feeling like they have to have a voice and they're fearful, but they're overcoming it a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine, and shout out to Chicago. It's where I'm from. I spent the first many of my years in Chicago, so shout out to Chicago. I will say that is an excellent question. I mean, we really had the convergence of two pandemics with us. And so it's a really complicated conversation, but let's be honest, the conversation about opening and closing schools is unique to this situation. The conversation that we're going to continue to have about race and racism is an ongoing conversation. So what I'm going to put out there are a couple things, and it is not the perfect solution. It is not the perfect answer, but just certainly some things to think about. One is, I think it's super important that as we have these conversations, we center the I point in the conversation. I am speaking on behalf of myself, my children, my experience, and I am here to hear and learn about your experience and your perspective and your thoughts. And I think that that idea of bringing your whole self to the table, not just your whole story, but your whole listening to the table, is a really powerful way to engage in the conversation. Because sometimes we learn things we didn't know, and sometimes we heard that we actually were like, what they heard wasn't exactly what we intended it to sound like. So there's that whole piece about open conversation that I think is super important that we engage in, and speaking from the space of I. And that's why our sessions always bring up this idea of identity. The other piece that I'd like to frame in this is this idea of cancel culture versus counsel culture. And I think that it's super important that what we recognize is that if we are canceling people too fast, we are oftentimes missing a big piece of what we need to understand. And I think that the quick cancel culture is coming because sometimes people are raising difficult conversations. And in our society, we have been told not to talk about X, Y, and Z because it's uncomfortable. Well, guess what? Uncomfortable helps us grow. In education, we talk about the zone of proximal development, that you got to be a little uncomfortable to keep growing your brain. And we talked about it in terms of math. I'm talking about it in terms of race. I'm talking about it in terms of learning differences. I'm talking about it in terms of let's own who we are. Let's think about who we are, and let's engage in meaningful conversations to learn about other people. So that empathy and compassion. So start with I, and think about counsel culture in terms of learning from and with other people, not cancel culture. So I think those are two big pieces that might help think about some of this.
That's great. I just want to interject because we're getting a bunch of questions. One, everybody who is attending and who registered will get a copy of the talk, and therefore the resources will be in that as well. We also can, we can also send a document so that those resources are also sent to you separately so that you've actually got the document. So everyone will get resources and the talk. Here's another question. What do you say to people who say, it's not my problem? Why should I bother myself if those other people have problems?
It's an excellent question. So there's a resource out there. It's a book, and I'm totally blanking on the author's name. It's called The Sum of Us. And the reality that we really want to think about, you see, so there you go. But it's this idea that we can actually trace back in our history, in the United States history, when people were begun to be pitted against each other. And that in and of itself is white supremacy culture, because essentially what happened was you had white landowning men, and you had some poor white people and some poor Black people who began to do some uprising. And this was very early in the founding of the United States. And the white landowning men said to the poor white men is that we'll find ways for you to enter into this space, and we'll find ways for you to enter into this space if you, right, tell on other people or do what we've asked for you to do. So part of our history is a sense of competition, where what we know when we study cultures and ways of being beyond the traditional United States culture is that we actually get further when we think about the sum of us, of all of us together. And when we think about what's happened in terms of if we disaggregate data, if we think about we are only the best is our lowest performing, we are really struggling. Whereas if we are to raise and support the lowest performing and provide greater access to and advantage for, we are going to improve things over time. And there's actually data on return. So from my business mindset, there is data on the return on investment that if you begin to invest and really think about employees at the front line who might be piecing together jobs or insurance, if you treat them well and you hear what's happening, you're actually going to have a higher return on your investment. So there's business evidence, there's evidence from an education standpoint in terms of how we differentiate in our classrooms and support all students. There are lots of spaces and places for us to think that we need to disrupt the mindset of competition is the best, and it's not our problem, because it is everybody's problem.
I mean, I have to say anecdotally again, you know, that was my beach read in Mexico, which was a funky book to read on the beach, but it was, the sum of us was, it was really outstanding and educational. And it's just a history and orientation that we don't have. So I really recommend it. Here's another one. And I mean, talk about, I love people, I love the format of this, because maybe people are slightly more bold in their ability to ask some questions. I'm aware that white women's curiosity can be a form of microaggression, and I'm trying to understand the balance between learning and advocating and being curious in a hurtful way. My question is, when someone is the only Black person in the room, is there something a white person can do or say to make the experience seem less traumatic and more uncomfortable?
You know, that's a really great question. And if I were to sit here as a white woman and say that there was one way to do this, I'm doing everything wrong. So the reality is to take the time and build a relationship with that person in the room and ask what helps to make them feel comfortable. At first, in a first meeting, and maybe it's an only meeting, you're actually probably not going to do that. You're not going to turn to the one Black woman in the room and say, what can I do to make you feel more comfortable, right? You're going to treat that person as you are treating every other person in the room. Over time, when you build relationships with people, I think asking individuals is a really great way to learn in individuals who you connect with, and doing that outreach to build those relationships slowly over time. And I'm going to make a plug for another book that actually just came out. So a colleague of mine, her name is Kimberly Williams. She is head of DEI at the Bush School, just wrote a book. And let me get the title for you. So if there's another question, and she actually really addresses it, I think, quite well in her book. It is called, excuse me, Please Come Home. Dear White Women, Please Come Home, Hand Me Your Bias and I'll Show You Our Connection. And the idea is it is a very forthright conversation around experiences that she has had as a Black woman and how to engage. Because nice. You know what, when a white woman shows up in the room and she starts crying because she's feeling compassion, you're centering yourself instead of the people who need to be centered. So there are lots of things we need to think about, and don't be scared to make a mistake. Yeah. You got to learn from your mistakes, right?
We'll put her in the queue for our next year's speaker series.
Oh, Kimberly? Oh, yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Great.
This question is particularly interesting to me personally as a Jew who doesn't consider herself white because of our history of violence, oppression, etc. So Toby asks, how can parents strongly request that everyone's history be incorporated into the curriculum? The problem lies with not knowing our histories. And what I would like to add on to that is there is a huge debate in our Jewish community. The Holocaust was taught. People assumed if you taught that it would decrease anti-Semitism. Not the case. So it's a complex question, but you're the doctor.
Without all the answers. So one thing that I know is, as an educator, is a really great way to approach this and to engage in conversation is there is no way as a high school history teacher in a year of history, even across the different histories that I taught, that I can teach the history of the world. You just can't do it. And history is growing every day. That's every minute, every second, right? I go back to that idea of identity and difference. And so giving students the space and place to connect their own histories, their own identities to the history that is being taught is, I think, the most meaningful way to do it. So you may have a core curriculum that you are kind of required to teach, because in this culture, we still have that core curriculum that's required. There's a nice way to kind of go in and out by allowing for individual connection. Right. So when we're looking at K-12 schools, you do need to look at the K-12 continuum, and that hopefully in those early elementary grades, that part of the history is understanding themselves within their community and within their broader school system. who are they, what's their personal history, and then connecting with people who have different histories. So I would say through kind of those in and out introspective opportunities.
Yeah. Before we move on, I want to ask that everyone take literally 10 seconds. We're going to post a survey just to find out where people are coming from so that we have a little bit more of an indication of where you're signing in from, whether you're in New York, Chicago, New Orleans, Seattle. With that, while people are doing that, I just want to thank you so much, Dr. Nash, because, this is such an important topic that we all have such good intentions around and are working towards just, the community of families improving life for everyone. And so thank you. I also want to invite people, upcoming in March, we have Living Like a Citizen. It's a great continuum of this conversation.
Oh, Eric Liu is amazing.
Yes, Living Like a Citizen, Raising Leaders in a Complicated World with Eric Liu, who not only is CEO and founder of Citizen University, he wrote an amazing book while he was he was in the Clinton administration on democracy. And he's extraordinary. And then also another event, Peaceful Parenting, Solutions for Your Toughest Behavior Challenges, with author and clinical psychologist Laura Markham. So with that, I just want to thank you again.
Thank
you. Really appreciate having you.
Thank you for having me. And I look forward to connecting with you in the future.
Great. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.